Today's reading comes from Genesis chapter 40, the cupbearer and the baker. Some time later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there was no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup into his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison, for I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, the Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to him in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. One of the peculiar things about these later chapters in the book of Genesis is how the events seem to unfold with very little reference to God. We hear of Israel's favoritism for Joseph, the anger of his brothers, and his being sold into slavery. We hear of his service in the court, followed by his framing in the scandal involving Potiphar's wife. All of this unfolds without really any mention of God or his activities, except for the 2nd verse of chapter 39, where it simply says that the Lord was with Joseph as he served his Egyptian master. One could easily think that God's presence simply recedes as the book of Genesis goes on. The burning presence of the creative God we find hovering over the waters in chapter 1 simply wanes as his creations rebel, as we are banished from the garden, as humankind fashions itself more and more in its own image. But this sort of thinking can only be misguided, since as we humans stray from God at the beginning of the Old Testament, we are only straying towards Jesus at the beginning of the New. As God anoints Abraham, then Joseph, then Moses, then David and the prophets, he can only be drawing closer to his people, not further. So the comparative scarcity of direct references to him in these later parts of Genesis, the absence of direct mentions of his actions here in the story of Joseph, the absence of the Lord did this or the Lord did that, cannot mean that God is far from the world, but simply that his movements must be traced in the background, as he speaks through dreams or through his servants, as seemingly random events accumulate into ordered plans. Genesis will tell us that it was Pharaoh who honored Joseph for his merits, but as the events unfold, we know that it was in equal measure God honoring Joseph for his faithfulness. Genesis will tell us that it was Joseph's brothers, not God, who conspired to sell him into slavery, and this is of course true, but their wicked choice was only the physical surface of the spiritual reality of a deeper trajectory that God had for Joseph's life, to raise Joseph up as his own faithful servant in the land of Egypt. Nowhere is this background presence of God more clear than in the dreams that we hear about throughout this portion of the book of Genesis. The dreams by which most of us remember Joseph, along with his colourful coat, and the dreams that Joseph both has and interprets for others. For it is through these dreams that we hear the voice of God in the background, a God who at this point in the biblical story chooses to speak through others without seeming to speak. When Joseph's fellow prisoners are troubled by their visions in the night, we are not even precisely told that it was God who gave these men their dreams, though he must have done in a sense. Joseph only says that the interpretation of dreams is God's job. Transforming the randomness of human experience into meaning is an activity distinctive of God's character, not simply the creation of dreams, but the translation of them. We know God by many names, but I sometimes wonder if God the interpreter might be another we could ascribe to him beside Creator. The God who can make sense of our so often garbled experiences as we kneel before him in prayer. For in the same way that these two prisoners come to Joseph, baffled and afraid, we also come to Jesus, so often confused and troubled by the turbulent realities of our lives, joys and sufferings all bundled together as if at random, so that it can be awfully hard to follow the fine thread of God's activity through it all. But given time, through reflection and prayer, God the interpreter can help us to perceive even a little bit his providence that was there throughout it all. As the story goes on, Joseph continues to maintain his connection with God, and little by little he sees his own muddled and painful experiences woven into a bigger narrative that God foretold in Joseph's own dreams in chapter 37. And as we leave Joseph and journey deeper into the Old Testament, we see how this story accumulates with others, equally odd and arbitrary to their inhabitants, into a spiritual tapestry of salvation, the story in which a captive Israel is set free from its slavery to sin and suffering, and is granted freedom in the promised land. Joseph's part in this bigger story must have seemed at the time to be just randomness and confusion, joys and sufferings and joys again, all mingled and strange. But as Joseph holds out despite this turbulence and grows old to see his own people flourish in a foreign land, God the interpreter weaves even his own tangled and confusing life into something meaningful and clear, revealing his plans to his servant Joseph, even if only slowly. In a similar way, when we, like Joseph in his despair in the Pharaoh's jail, or the prisoners who suffer beside him, as we bring our tangled experiences to the foot of the cross, given time and prayer, we trust that we too may see what was once smoke accumulate into something meaningful, as God the interpreter reveals his plans that he always had for us, for our family, or even for our nation, an accumulation of meaning, which in this life may only ever be partial, but whose partiality hints at a fullness that will come when we are raised with Christ in the last days. In the face of all of this, what is remarkable about Joseph is his faithfulness. In prison, he does not blame God for what many of us easily could. In a foreign land, his career in ruins, he maintains his connection with God, speaks of God frankly to men for whom we can only imagine monotheism was an utterly alien concept. But it is this very fact that he does not turn on God, that he does not cut him out and sever his connection with God, that enables him to serve God, here by loving two people in a pretty desperate plight. It really shines through how Joseph treats these men, even the doomed one, with frankness and respect, first taking responsibility for them in his discussion with the jailer, and second in his frank receptivity to their dreams. We can only imagine these fellow prisoners must have noticed something different about Joseph already for them to be comfortable enough to share these bizarre visions with him, with any hope of enlightenment. And it is because Joseph, even in the face of the randomness and confusion that he himself is living through, continues to trust in God, that through that trust he is able to gift a clarity to these men that even he himself lacks. For it is curious that God gives Joseph the power to interpret these men's dreams before even his own. For those confusing dreams of his brothers that Joseph had only a few chapters ago have not yet really been interpreted. We have no indication that Joseph knew what they meant then. His brothers only speculate. And at this point, sitting in prison, destitute and ashamed, It is hard to imagine that the actual glamorous interpretation of those dreams would have left a mind. Like Joseph, we should trust God even in the face of such uncertainty, and not be envious of others when God grants them a certainty about their lives that we ourselves lack. God gives out spiritual clarity and understanding in the same way that he gives out his more material blessings, at his own pace and in his own time. Like Joseph, we should be patient with our lot and trust that God's providence is working through our lives, even when our lives seem tangled and confused, even when, as so often happens, other people seem to have a much greater idea than we do about God's mission for them, or why they are where they are at a certain stage of life. Joseph has no idea what the future holds for him at this moment, and yet with grace and clarity he interprets dreams for others, good ones and bad ones, without envy or malice, trusting only that God has a similar plan for his own life, as he so clearly did for these men. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, thank you that as well as creator, you, Lord, are the interpreter. Thank you that you, just as you made sense of so many dreams in the Bible, but particularly these dreams here in Genesis 40, thank you that it is really your nature to interpret our experience for us. That when we bring our often confused and troubled lives and experiences to you, that it really is your nature to reveal their meaning to us as we progress through life and through time. Lord, I just pray that we would be able to look to this story of Joseph as a real source of encouragement, that we'd be able to be patient like Joseph when our lives seem confusing, when the future's not certain, even when it seems certain for other people. I pray that we'd be able to be inspired by Joseph, to be patient and gracious under those circumstances nevertheless. Amen.